So we're on air, so I have no choice to start. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good part of the day, everyone. Welcome to the largest and fastest growing large-scale Scrum community over New York City, but has gone virally globally over the last couple of years, even pre-COVID. Thank you for being here. Today, I would like to take us through the subject to the set of questions that have been raised more than once, at least in my line of work, um, experience with customers and also just with people in communities. So we hear this a lot, and I'm sure those of you that have been around organizations that are, fiddling with different ways of working in adaptive ways, they have seen this and heard this before. But we use Kanban with instead of Scrum or large scale Scrum. And can we mix and match? Can we do both? Can we do one in sequence? These questions are always, we always need to understand what are the merits of those questions? Where do they come from? Why do people, who asks and why do they ask? So let me first, I do apologize to anyone who joins. Please make sure you unmute. Let me first give I guess, the deserved shout out, the deserved recognition to those people with whom these light adaptive frameworks should be associated with. I think Kanban, the shout out should really go to Taiichi Ono. Scrum go to Ken Schreiber and Jeff Sutherland. And of course, large scale Scrum has been well known and documented for a long time. Has taken more of a formal form just a couple of years ago. But Craig Larman and Bas Bodie have done tons of research in this space, and the other ones that are responsible for less creation as a framework and having this publicized and populated across the globe. So let me first address this question. Who is asking and why are people asking? What should be used? When should things be used? How they should be mixed? So who asks really matters, I think. So we need to kind of understand where these questions are coming from and for what purpose. What's the driver? Why people ask? Are these real teams that are trying to contemplate what's the better approach to manage their work? Are these coaches or scrum masters perhaps that are enabling and facilitating those very discussions that are asking powerful questions? Maybe business folks, POs, users that trying to understand what, how work gets done and how it gets delivered. Although we need to understand also why is it important to them, what happens within teams. Maybe they ask this question because they need to know how they will be engaged. So we need to understand where this questioning is coming from. Maybe this is legal or compliance. Maybe they need to document or capture certain stuff that is easier to do with one approach, one framework versus another. Again, I could hardly think of any explicit distinctions there, not offhand, but maybe. And what I have there at the very bottom is more of a irony, right? Methodology people, tooling experts. Sometimes we get questions from those. Why we use this versus that? Does it fit? Well, we cannot use one framework versus another because it doesn't fit our tooling convention. That's probably not a good reason. Or we are the XYZ shop, and therefore we shouldn't be looking into anything else because that's not has not been endorsed by our organizational those that lead this transformation effort or whatever this adaptive agile effort is underway. So we really need to understand where this is coming from. And this is why this is also important. We need to assume that people that ask have a certain degree of knowledge. What is what? Otherwise, we may end up people that are maybe even arrogant, asking questions that are pretty irrelevant. So who asks matters, and what they understand so far also matters. I'm gonna give a few quotes here that are also relevant. The one is from Ken Schreiber, and another one is from Bas Bodie, the co-creator of Scrum and the co-creator of LeSS, respectively. I think it's important to understand that, for example, Scrum, that has been around for more than 20 years, is not a methodology, is not an operating model. It's not something that you just install underneath the existing organizational structure, and you unpack and install and try to pick and choose elements from it as you see needed. Most likely you will end up with what's called sunk cost fallacy. If something isn't there already, you're most likely going to have to use it. So with Scrum, we'll consider this a minimal empirical process. We add things only when and if needed. So it's organically building up. So again, this is like a Scrum flyby, 30,000 miles an hour, 30,000 feet above flyby. Scrum, one team, one product owner, one Scrum Master, one team, one product backlog, of course, sprint backlog as a temporary instance in time as we go through the sprint, and obviously one potential shippable product. There should be nothing new there. Going along with the same, on the same note, one PO, one product owner, one product backlog, customer-centric, feature-centric, customer-focused, feature-centric ways of working, cross-functional teams, cross-component, PSPI, IDM. Nothing new there. Worth mentioning a few typical challenges we see with less adoption. With Scrum adoption or Scrum implementation, if you rather choose that word. And you may not, you're not required to read SQL here, but this is a very simple SQL update statement, where organizations oftentimes, instead of changing HR norms and policies in the career path and improving HR norms and policies and supporting Scrum roles and other dynamics that are associated with Scrum, instead of doing that, they go into plan B and just relabel existing roles into Scrum roles by essentially looking at a pay grade or organizational position as it stands at the moment. So you take a senior manager, turn them into an enterprise coach, senior coach, junior project manager becomes a Scrum Master, and a BA becomes a PO. This is a typical, classically seen omission with roles and responsibilities. Organizations are just trying to go from from the old ways of working into so-called new ways of working without really changing much. In the same vein, on the same note, a great book to maybe download and read from Roman Pickler, where he talks about this problem. Just because you have too many people, even at some executive level, together in the same room, locked up, calling themselves a committee, unless you have a single voice that sets priorities and makes ultimate decisions, this would be referred as a death by a committee, right? So you still need to have a person who will make ultimate decisions on priorities, on strategies and vision. This isn't something you just leave hanging and give to teams to figure out on their own. This is not what developers do. They don't set business priorities for business people. Another interest, so by the way, the first couple of minutes, the first few slides will be mostly rehashing and reminding us of what Scrum, LeSS, and Kanban are. And as you may already know, I sometimes approach this from the angle of things that we know that are not working well that need to be fixed. Here's another one. I leverage this great content that was created by Michael James, MJ of Seattle, a great video to watch, a great comic books to download. Essentially, he talks about this facetious, non-existent role of a TOO, team output owner, a person who has been assigned the role of a PO, most likely against their will, who is really not in a good position to handle responsibilities because they are not empowered, they're not properly positioned, but because of the organizational settings and organizational dynamics, they must do it. So they end up being team output owner, someone who's focused on output, not outcome. with lots of negative fallout that comes from it. So another thing to keep in mind and avoid, of course. Just a little bit on large scale Scrum. So, and this is why we're so adamant, so explicit in asking people that come to less learning, less training, you really need to understand well the purpose, intentions, and elegancy of one team Scrum. Because large scale Scrum in many ways is very much consistent with Scrum. So not understanding Scrum and not understanding its purpose would be rather challenging, for people that are trying to learn about large scale Scrum, right? So that's not a trivial thing. And large scale Scrum, of course, again, this isn't about large scale Scrum per se, this isn't a LeSS training course, but large scale Scrum, if we look at this from 30,000 feet view, this is essentially, almost consider these as stacks of on par cross-functional teams side by side, working for the same product owner out of the same backlog, on the same product, towards the same potentially shippable product increment. And then if so, these teams really should be considered as organizational building blocks of our organization, and LeSS product group as a whole would be the organizational structure. We oftentimes refer to this as a parallel organization, because when we build it organically ground up, it needs its own space to succeed, to flourish, to have a chance. So that's really a large scale Scrum in a nutshell. Although
okay, this is a test.
Yes, Jeff, you have been tested. You're good. We just mute you. Thank you. And now let me just drop a few nuggets about Kanban. Again, this isn't a deep dive into either one of these light frameworks explicitly. It's implicitly assumed that everyone is well aware of all those three. So that's why people are trying to understand the pluses and minuses of mixing and matching. So when we talk about Kanban, mostly we hear, about pull versus push system. One is being more, less wasteful, less, less cumbersome, more precise, driven by demand, smoother, more cost-effective. Of course, referring to the pull system, with the push system being a traditional, traditional legacy way of working with everything planned up front, budget and timeline and scope locked, with traditional managerial control, command and control pushing on top of people. That's a push system. That's something we do not wish to see in Kanban, in fact, or in Scrum, because both systems are very much pull systems. But at least in my personal brain, in my history of learning, every time I hear pull system, immediately I think of Kanban, and then also about Scrum. But Kanban really is the first thing I hear in my brain. Yeah, thank you. So Kanban, of course, again, there's some other things we can discuss about Kanban, but when we look at Kanban board, for example, typically what comes to mind, at least in my experience, it's typically has more cues and longer and more comprehensive than Scrum, because what we do in Kanban, we oftentimes compensate for fixed time boxes. That is essentially our sprint, with many mini controls, minimal controls by each individual queue. So oftentimes what we see with Kanban, we hear a lot about this. WIP limits, WIP limit violations, what did they come from, what causes them, and what are the repercussions of them. So at least in my view, when we see Kanban, we immediately think of many queues with WIP limits and violations, if there are any. And by the way, of course, we need to see how many today, how many so-called Kanban teams actually do set WIP limits and honor them. Also, the good old cumulative flow management, cumulative flow diagram is another thing that is oftentimes associated with Kanban. Same, I guess, rhetorical question: how many teams that claim that they do Kanban actually pay attention to this and know how to explain that they have so much in WIP in their beloved graphic, and what does it really mean to them? Can they really interpret this? Can they understand this? Kanban is also about queues, queue management, and queue divergence and convergence. As I mentioned before, about WIP limits, about bubbles and bottlenecks that we often see in Kanban flow with various degrees of turbulence because of those bubbles and bottlenecks, those that have driven across interstate and across toll bridges, maybe not lately because everything is automated. Those easy passes let you fly by so fast. But back in the days, if you drive across a bridge that has a toll booth, you know that everyone slows down and there's a congestion up front because you have a queue capacity. Server capacity is very low. And then, of course, once you pay your toll fee, you start zooming out and you have like a vacuum beyond that toll booth. So those problems actually have been resolved with overhead easy passes, if you know what I'm referring to. With those overhead easy passes, you can keep driving without slowing down, and it evens out of flow. So again, this could be easily brought back to Kanban workflow management and looking at how teams do work today and see if they even leverage this concept. Queue escalation. Have we seen too many teams today that say we do Kanban, yet they really have no concept of queue escalation to various swim lanes? They just have everything in one big lane, congesting the queues with violating WIP limits. Yeah, we use Kanban, and we'll get to bad reasons why they use Kanban, of course, in a few minutes. So that's another thing to pay attention to. And of course, we can associate Kanban with lean product development, and what we have learned from, some of the, I don't want to call it high education, but we can actually learn a lot from lean manufacturing and lean economics and apply it to Kanban. Here's an example of a screenshot from the book by Don Reynerson, Economics of Workflow Management. It's an example of congestion collapse. In Kanban, we manage throughput. We look at throughput more than not velocity. I'm sure you're familiar with that, with the term throughput. So here's what, just like we constantly say, do not stress the importance of high velocity. Do not cause system gaming, and do not cause numbers fudging in Scrum by stressing the criticality of velocity. The same thing goes for Kanban. If you keep stressing throughput, you will have this throughput properly rising, partially due to system gaming and partially due to much harder work. But then you're going to have what's called congestion collapse. And if you think of a highway, for example, it would be gridlock. It's a complete congestion. So that's not a good thing. Speaking of Kanban, we often look at variability pooling, and this means we are challenging the need of doing micromanagement and micro estimation, very granular estimation, because with introducing too many microscopic estimation, we actually increase what's called noise in estimation. So we oftentimes think of, okay, why not just keep things relatively steady and estimate it at coarse grain level so that we don't introduce artificial inaccuracy. And this is, by the way, very scientific, so we don't need to ask, well, we can ask for proof of this, but this is scientifically proven. Optimum batch size, it's another big thing we often forget to look at. What's big enough to ship, or should we ship incrementally immediately? Absolutely, we should be able to do so, but strategically or economically, this may not be the call that a product owner makes or a business makes. That's the typical balance between holding cost and transaction cost. Transaction costs usually go down significantly with great automation techniques such as CI/CD pipeline and and other great ways of having computers and machines do human work. So transactional costs are really going to be a function of that. This is actually another very interesting one. Not too many Kanbanists, not too many Kanban lovers actually understand this. The typical queuing system is very sensitive. If you think of the airport wait line when let's say when you offboard the plane and you go to a passport control, you maybe can associate with some of these. There are different ways to manage queues. You can have different lanes, different queues with different low capacity servers. You can have one queue that is relatively small, very tiny, very thin, and a few smaller capacity servers, which means at any point in time, any given server could be very light-handed. Think of those airports where you have a single line of people. All of them are waiting to go through one centralized toll gate, and 10 or 20 different stations where passport control agents sit, and some of them are just waiting for people to come in because it is not even. The flow isn't even at the server level. Or you can have one thicker, one more high capacity flow, and one big high capacity server. When you have a few those very passport agents clustered together, not at different booths, but somewhere in a centralized location. So it's really all conditional, circumstantial. And this is really the book I was referring to. I recommend considering this book as a great read. Again, some great thoughts, tools, techniques to leverage. So, and of course, we can go on. We can go on by looking at Little's Law. I mean, today, how many Kanban teams actually understand what a Little's Law, what Little's theory, the queuing theory is in principle? Oftentimes, I see not. I see oftentimes people that are Kanban centric. So some of them are very great at they have some great theoretical and practical knowledge, but many people do not. So they associate Kanban with the Kanban board that is offered by their tool. And we will talk about some not so great reasons why you will use one versus another. So this will come up. Some other things that are great things about Kanban. Remember this, you recorded the time when the request was submitted, and then when the priority was set, and when work started, and actually when work was finished. So you can essentially, be pretty scientific about this if you want, or at least accurate. Look at reaction time, wait time, cycle time, and overall lead time from the moment your request was submitted to the moment your work was done. So those are great ways to manage and to keep track of whatever term you wish to use, how you work and why you work in such a way. Now, managing this implies that people understand what they're doing. People understand what this is all about. So just having a line manager trying to manage this will really not work. You really need teams and educated facilitators to look into this together with teams, not without teams. So we really wish to avoid these uneducated conclusions, right? Scrum is better than less, or less is better than Scrum, or vice versa, or some of these combinations are better than anything that's in its pure form. This is what I call false dichotomy. It's either or. It's either this. Essentially, if we mix any ingredients, if we add anything to anything else, or any knowledge or concept that we derive from one place, if we just mix it with something else, we need to understand why we're doing this. So I wanted to give you just a few thoughts about what could be not such great reasons. Specifically, we hear about Kanban versus Scrum, Kanban versus LeSS. Not so great reasons of mixing Kanban, and whether it's Scrum or large scale Scrum, it really doesn't matter. So let's take a look at those, and maybe we'll then look at some better ones. So I kind of summarize those in top 10. Excuse me. How many of you are familiar with this one? And I'm gonna probably, probably should ask questions later, because if I open up the questions now, people will say, "Oh yeah, we've seen this 1,000 times." So let me just hold off. We hear people say, "Well, Jira mechanics are too convoluted for us. We can't really use Scrum because it's just not clear to us, or any other tool that you use that has the word Agile in it. We'll just use Kanban. It's just easier to use." That's really it's a lame excuse. It's not a good reason why. Probably you should want to go back and understand, why do you have these convoluted mechanics in the first place? This is an organizational problem, big time. We have our enterprise tooling system that is centrally controlled, with very little opportunities given to teams to inspect and adapt at the team level. We'll just use Kanban instead of Scrum. Our PO, although we have clearly defined, identified the benefits and advantages of using Scrum, now we're in the situation where PO is totally disengaged. She or he does not want to attend to our events. So if we keep calling it Scrum, we're gonna get scolded and criticized. So why do that? Let's simplify our lives and just go to Kanban, because formally it's not a mandatory role. I mean, there could be a PO figure in Kanban, but this isn't really prescribed per se. So we'll look for an easy way out. Same reasoning with the Scrum Master, right? Although you can have a Kanban facilitator, Kanban expert, because you're failing with this role in Scrum, not to be scrutinized or scolded by the rest of the organization that, hey, your Scrum is weak. Let's fall back to Plan B. Not being able to protect your scope and seeing too many extra external forces coming and pushing on you being a team of teams in plural, is really a bad reason to shift from one to another. So you cannot deliver a potential shippable product increment, and this is why you go into Kanban. Well, as we've already heard this, but we'll hear this again. Nothing ever says anywhere that with Kanban you shouldn't be able to deliver to production something that's shippable and finished and shippable very soon. In fact, there are different time boxing rules apply, but still, nevertheless, this is not a good reason. Just because you cannot deliver anything shippable does not mean you want to fall back to the less formal, less, I guess, prescriptive is also not the right word. It's just not a good reason to fall into Kanban. Our so-called product backlog is full of technical items. Well, perhaps we need to look into why your backlog is so super technical. Maybe there was a good reason. Maybe you're in some sort of a, production support backend type of work only, and you haven't really moved into product-centric development. Then if so, maybe this is the way for you to manage workflow for now. But don't take it immediately as a get out of jail free ticket. Because our work is technical, maybe it is technical because you have purely component teams. People are really not looking customer. People aren't looking customer centricity or product centricity, and this is not a good thing. Maybe your backlog is really not a product backlog, but a bunch of technical tasks, and you could have avoided that if you did things differently. So don't immediately go to Plan B without really considering, looking into some of the potential root causes of this. This is one of the classic ones I've seen because of very clearly defined, identified, well-known classic organizational impediments, organizational challenges, such as unsteady teams, developers not being cross-functional and not being interested in learning other techniques and tools. We have a lot of instability and velocity. And it's not so much we need to focus on it first prime, It's not the first goal of Scrum or Logical Scrum to look at velocities by any means. Velocity should never be the main goal of it. Adaptiveness, agility should be, not speed. Nevertheless, if teams have very hard time establishing a steady velocity, sometimes they just fall back in the Kanban. It's almost like a shame. We can't establish steady velocity. People come and go. We have shared assets. People don't dedicate themselves full time. So we just can't establish a steady velocity, and it just doesn't look good. So let's say we use Kanban, because in Kanban we use throughput, and the rest of the organization is hardly there understanding what it is. So we're gonna get lost in the debris, in the weeds of this, and we don't have to explain why we don't have velocity, because we use Kanban. And it has throughput. So let's leave it at that. And of course, this is just another, I guess, cheap way to get out of the problem. This is another big misconception, right? Kanban is purely an IT thing. And because this is how we handle it internally, we don't need to engage business people. We don't need to look for a product. Let's just use Kanban. There could be instances, of course, where in specific phases, maybe, and it really depends on the organizational size and what you do. There could be potential some streams of work where you have less interaction with customers and users. And then if so, maybe Kanban as a workflow management way of working is a very applicable thing, even as a standalone. Maybe Kanban, maybe Scrum would be an overhead. Maybe Scrum would not be as fruitful as in product-centric environment. But this is hardly the case for majority of companies, and hardly the case for majority of organizations and teams, because for the most part, problems we face are organizational design problems that need to be addressed. And then customer centricity and product focus would become more of a norm. So again, another one, I'm not going to say too much in this. Well, sometimes there's a misconception that in Kanban, we absolutely do not look into full stack developers or cross-functional developers. We totally loosen up this requirement, or loosen up this, we'll loosen this expectation. This is not really true. We really wish to see developers, even in Kanban, with multiple skills, so they can actually work, on both sides of the spectrum. Maybe my primary skill set and my secondary and tertiary, upstream and downstream from my primary queue. So that's not automatically a good reason to switch from one to another. And the last one out of these 10, of course, you can think of more, or maybe you can even say some of these are less important than others. It's the perception of Kanban as something that is less organizational design and organizational structure centric. With Kanban, we shall not be challenging organizational dysfunction as much, and this is why we are safer to use Kanban, because we will not be calling out all of those problems and all of those systemic impediments that otherwise need to be fixed. And then if so, we will not be taking our managers out of their complacency and comfort zone, where they change almost nothing and just delegate everything to teams. So these are not such good reasons, but there could be some better ones. And let me just give you a few nuggets there. Our work is truly customer service, maybe back-end production support only. And anyway we slice it at the moment, we don't see as much interaction between developers and business people. Maybe this isn't the ideal state, and this is because of the lack of attention to product-centric discussions, lack of attention to what a product should really be. But if this is clearly identified, and it seems to be true that there's so much customer-centric work and back-end production support work, maybe teams wish to start with Kanban just to establish some steady state workflow, some evenness in their workflow, and just to learn how to work together as teams by passing work gradually from left to right, from queue to queue. Maybe there is no need to have these, pretty well defined and somewhat prescribed in minimalistic, of course, in Scrum and in large scale Scrum events where you expect users and customers to attend and provide clarification. Maybe because things are so organic and so informal, maybe it's a smaller company. There's so much going on anyway, so much interaction between developers and business people, then these formal events are not necessary. So you really appreciate more of a gradual workflow, and you see too much side-by-side developers and like literally a developer and a business person sit side by side, then it becomes trivial to have these additional, scheduled events. Again, we need to understand why this is the case, and if this is truly an overhead, and maybe those events are less critical, maybe we can ease it up. You just do a great job delivering from to do to done. Sprints as time boxes become almost transparent, almost, I don't want to say trivial, because I always see value in doing a structured touch point, even in Kanban. But nevertheless, maybe you want to ease it up, and instead of constantly planning for 1 week or for 2 weeks, you just use a pull system and gradually pull work in and put it out. Maybe your SLAs are so short, then having sprints almost makes no sense, because any sprint, even a short sprint, would add more overhead and almost unnecessary waste that you could have avoided otherwise if you did not have sprints. Maybe your SLA is like 24 or 48 hours. I can't imagine, I cannot have a good reason why someone would have a sprint that it's shorter than 1 week, even a small team. You're able, some of these are, if not redundant, but at least they're very, very related to one another. Number 5 is you have full adoption of CI/CD. So you literally, this is the steady flow. This is a gradual flow of items, maybe with toggles off from development environment to QA to high environment to production, and you really treat it as a steady flow, and you really want to leverage Kanban for it. You have more appetite for it. This is another one, going back to the item number 7 on the previous slide, I think, about velocities. Well, in Kanban, we use the throughput, and I'm sure you understand what the term means. Think of this as a X number of cubic feet of water gushing out of your fire hose in a fraction of a second. So this is essentially a throughput. Throughput in Kanban, actually, accuracy-wise or even precision-wise, even higher than velocity in Scrum, because you almost can't tell at any point in time how much work gets done, because instead of measuring every 2 weeks or every 1 week, you look at things every day or every couple hours. How many items did you get off the assembly line within the last 3 hours? So if size and complexity, if your sizing capabilities, if your estimation capabilities have become so so reliable, so you don't need to go to story point estimation. You can just say pretty much every item there is 5 story points according to our understanding. So instead of counting story points, let's just count number of items. Then maybe you want to consider either velocity being measured in stories, not story points, or maybe you want to go back and think, okay, Kanban, throughput. Every 3 hours, we release 4 backlog items. That's a good prediction. So what can you do in 24 hours if you do this much in 3 hours? Pretty accurate. There's another one. If your intake of work items is very steady and gradual, and you almost don't have an upstream backlog built up, it just comes and it goes, comes and goes. Very fluid, very very organic. Maybe you want to consider Kanban. Kanban will just give you this pass-through, um, you know, transmission as opposed to building up a backlog that needs to be constantly prioritized. You may have multiple streams of work. With Kanban, you can have conversions and diversions of queues. Another thing, you actually have to look at the enterprise-wide Kanban then. And then if so, you may want to consider, making sure that your WIP limits downstream are supportive of WIP stream limits upstream, because you may have multiple queues converging into multiple streams converging into one largest stream. So you need to have a high capacity server downstream than you have upstream. Again, not to sound overly scientific, but those things are kind of important, because otherwise you're going to have an influx of work, like a few pipes coming into the same single pipe. And if it's the same section pipe, cross section pipe, you're going to have much higher speed. Maybe you remember from college, from physics, the law of Bernoulli, the Bernoulli law with water. That's going to be a good analogy there. So you want to compensate for that with a high capacity server, high pipe, so that the water doesn't go as fast, because otherwise. So there are nuances there. You may also rely on work done by third parties, by vendors, or by other companies. So if they already use Kanban and they're pretty successful at it, and they have a certain cadence, of Kanban is called tuck time, then you may want to get in their tuck time, so that there's some consistency and evenness in workflow. It's not a bad reason, probably. Maybe you today are facing the challenges with building cross-functional feature teams. Organizational constraints are so difficult, so strong, so immovable, that it's hard for you to build cross-functional feature teams. So you think in terms of, well, can we at least have few specific workers that can work a little bit to help upstream and downstream, which actually gets us closer to becoming cross-functional, because someone works a little bit of upstream and a little bit of downstream, essentially is a multi-skilled, multifaceted developer. Again, I wouldn't take immediately, oh, since we don't have cross-functional teams, that's okay, we'll go to Kanban. This is actually not the message here at all. Maybe this is a temporary solution to your problem, to your current problem. Maybe cross-functional teams should be your aspiration, because you are truly trying to define a product. Then you may want to temporarily settle for something that is not very customer centric, but you want to change this shortly. So don't immediately dismiss the need of thinking and building cross-functional feature teams, and consider maybe Kanban as the add-on to it. I have only 10 minutes, so let me just give you a few extra nuggets. How you can potentially mix these things together and maybe not create too much confusion. So you can always leverage Kanban, strong emphasis on pull system. And it's almost like an include statement, because there's so much we know about the pull system. And we refer to Kanban and some other, some learning is required in that. You can explicitly put WIP limits on sprint queues. And I typically see this being more, there's more awareness about WIP limits when we talk about Kanban, although people speak about it, they don't necessarily, protect their WIP limits. Oftentimes we see lots of violation going on there, but at least they talk about it. In Scrum, I don't hear a lot of people talking about WIP limits. This is actually a very Kanbanish conversation right there. So I would recommend leveraging it. So plan as per sprint, manage your work inside a sprint with lots of things that you learn from Kanban. Look at one-piece workflow, what we refer to as a swarming, as the great way to manage work. Again, so the reason why I refer to this as mixing with Scrum or less, because some of these 1 through 10 would be, at least in my experience, primarily mentioned in Kanban, but nothing should prevent us from leveraging the same in Scrum. Okay. Moving away from story points because your estimation is just way too consistent. So why keep saying in 3 versus 5 versus 8 when you have gotten to a point where pretty much anything you estimate is roughly 5 to 8. There's just one, just call it a backlog item. We are doing 3 stories. We're doing 3 or 4 backlog items in one sprint. So that's just a way to ease up on itself, on yourself. You can measure reaction time for each product increment, backlog item as it's entered in the backlog before a product owner gets to set priorities. So you're still in Scrum, but you're just measuring, a PO should be measuring this for themselves. How long does it take me to take an item that comes from business people and actually set priorities on? You can measure wait time. How long does it take for a backlog item that I have prioritized to get done? So you can run this maybe as a minimal metric that a PO can do on themselves. Cycle time. This is probably more for a team, right? So how long does it take us to get our work from start to finish? That just, managing cycle time of your WIP is probably the easiest thing for a team to do. How long did we have this item sitting in progress or in WIP, work in progress? Measuring lead time for each product for each product increment, from the moment it gets created to the moment it gets fully done, including what's called an undone department, undone work that's required to do to finish after in order for you to go to production. For many teams, unfortunately, this is still the case, because when they finish this sprint, there's work that still remains to be done. And this is typically work that is given to XYZ teams, such as integration teams, coordination teams, deployment teams, delivery teams, DevOps teams. I cannot go to production yet teams. All those after sprint ends teams. We refer to this as an undone work, not something you wish to have because you want to shrink it over time and expand your definition of done. But nevertheless, when you measure lead time, it's from the moment your PI gets created all the way to it actually gets deployed. So you can also look at batch size to see if it's optimized for transaction and holding costs. And last but not least, measuring flow for queues from different teams. So if in large scale Scrum, you may potentially look at different flows of work of different teams. Again, teams should be doing it for themselves, not managers outside of less product group. It's the teams. Maybe they can identify improvement opportunities for improvements. Maybe one team has constantly clogged queues because they miss a specific skill set, and this could be fixed through mentoring or from using what's called developers travelers, someone who goes from one team to another to seed knowledge. So you can leverage any one or multiple of these tools and techniques, if you will, of Kanban to improve, to enhance your Scrum or large-scale Scrum mechanics. Just one last point I would like to make before we wrap this is, we have to be smart cooks, right? So you just don't want to throw everything in the same pot, mix it up, and call it, hey, now we mixed it all together. We're doing both. We're both, and this we can put a check mark somewhere in the Excel spreadsheet that measures our agility. If you mix and match some of these, you really have to be good with understanding why you're doing this. So if you're adding something, it has to have an explicit, well understood value. I'm realizing I'm 5 minutes before the hour. I'm willing to go a little bit extra because I can manage my own time. I'm going to pause now. So I'm happy to take some questions, and I'll answer them to the extent that I have experienced, have seen personally now. And I do apologize for the last 3 slides. They were very dense in text and not something I prefer, but it helped me summarize some of my thoughts. So any questions, you can feel free to unmute or type in if you wish. I prefer actually not to type in, I prefer the voice in the face if you can. Hey folks, the floor is open, so.
Hi, Jean. This is Nicole. A few slides back when you were talking about some of the reasons that are not great for using Kanban.
Yep.
Yep. There, I think it was number 10.
I'm there now.
But it had to, yeah, okay. Kanban not focused on challenge organizational design. And not to like push back on managers, not like a little reluctance to like push back on leadership. So I have some teams that are kind of like that. We're working in a transformational change where we're also working for a cultural change. And the culture had historically been, you do as you're told, you don't ask questions, right, wrong, or whatever. And so we're trying to also build this the agile mindset, but also this cultural mindset that the leaders and your direct managers are learning all of this new too. And if they're making a mistake and you're a Scrum Master or you're a Kanban lead, it's okay to make them aware of that respectfully. I was wondering, do you have any insight as a coach? How do you work with those teams that are reluctant? How do you have conversations with individuals who have difficulty having those conversations with their managers, and how do you kind of help them see the light, so to speak, so that they can use the right framework to become more successful, happier, productive teams?
So thank you for the question, Nicole. So I guess I'll speak from my experience, primarily speaking from my own experience. So I think you said it, it's my experience is somewhat consistent with what you said. If we are doing this is based on a prescriptive approach, a manager or someone who is in charge of teams or essentially has a say comes around and says, we are doing Kanban because we are Kanban shop, or we are doing Scrum because we're Scrum shop. That either or is actually a very wrong way to approach this. Maybe for a given team or a given set of teams, this approach would not be the best. So you clearly you take away the degree of safety, operational safety, decision-making safety from teams. Also, and I actually have quite a few friends, developers. If you ask developers informally, not within corporate settings, but at their free time, they are overall very frustrated and very aggravated with agile gurus these days, because there's so much going on there that has been it has mutated from what it used to be, what it was meant to be. So for many developers, for many teams, Scrum versus Kanban is just like another project management fad, because they have very little control over it. The essence of it has been lost, and they don't have much to say. So a team can't really come together freely, openly, in many cases, and make their own decisions, choose their own destiny. So this is probably can only be fixed if we stop treating this is Kanban shop versus Scrum shop, or less shop because some professorial mandatorial mandate came from up above. You really have to look at the individual situation, and of course you want to have some standardized understanding and standardized quality learning. But when a team says you guys are not doing Scrum, why not? Well, because we can't find a good product owner for you. Well, what do you mean no? There's one right there. And we actually develop business objects. We develop backlog items for that person. Well, that person can't really engage with you guys because she or he is very busy with business work, and instead of having delegated this role to a proxy or a proxy or a proxy to a BA, we'll just give it up altogether. We're not going to do Scrum. We're going to do Kanban. So it's you settle for something that's much smaller. That's which is not. This is not a right way to frame Kanban. It's just we see people fall into this trap because
right, and that's where I'm having some difficulty. I'm a Scrum Master, and I'm helping. I'm getting into a position where I'm helping also mentor about 40 other teams, and there's a small group where, even though I've helped explain that the intent of agile frameworks are not to solve the problems but to highlight them, a lot of the resistance is not to do the change, but to really, the resistance is that they don't want to tell the leaders that what we've been doing is wrong.
Yeah.
Because they think that if they tell their manager that, hey, we're doing this wrong, that they're going to somehow it's going to backfire on them. And I don't know how to carry that conversation, that their job is relatively safe, and that the intent of this transformation is to say, hey, you know what, we need to do this better, and here's what I think. I don't know how to have that conversation. I don't know if you are planning another workshop on something along those lines, or.
Well, we haven't had anything specifically in the hopper just for that, but out of curiosity, I'm not even sure how to mentoring 40 teams at once is even possible. I mean, if someone is being put against this effort, it must be a very, monumental, unhuman undertaking. So I can only empathize. Now, as far as, so everything that you have described so far, it sounds like understanding and learning has been delegated and downsized and trivialized to the people that are beneath. Senior executives are very much not engaged, and they're unplugged. So I would start with executive management, executives education, how it comes. Okay. Yeah, I see. I think Rusty. Hi, Nicole. Hopefully this answers your question a little bit.
Yes, thank you.
Sure. Rusty, you have a hand raised. Hopefully it's either a comment or a question.
It's a comment. Forgive me, I got some background noise going on in Starbucks with some music. Can you hear me?
Did you want to?
Can you hear me?
It's pretty noisy from the background. It's very, very crackling. If you want to type it in. Yeah, I just see.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Sure, Catherine. Yes.
Okay. While Rusty fixes problem. We're about to go through an agile transformation, and the HR technology group specifically, they act more like a call center. So they don't really have projects. They have like quick fixes that they need to do for their clients. So I'm going to recommend Kanban. Do you agree with that? And what is your favorite tool to track Kanban?
So Catherine, I'm going to start backwards. I have zero preference for tools, although I've been around a good half a dozen of them. They all could be somewhat useful and seriously harmful if misused. If the main focus of transformation, as you referred to, is about tooling, then doesn't matter what tool is being used, it will be most likely, it will end with the tooling. So I would probably trivialize that altogether. Although the way to say this is, the simpler the tool, the fewer buttons you need to click, the fewer transitions and schemas and permutations you have to deal with, the better. So if you can take even a more complex commercial tool and gut it and make it into something simple, then I would recommend using that tool. So those
Yeah,
more
absolutely agree with that. Was just wondering which one that you recommend for a simple
again, I mean,
Kanban board.
I could, I could say if you use Jira, for example, got it. Take a very simple approach with this. Use the out-of-the-box workflow. Do not, add only very few queues. Maybe set WIP limits, create swim lanes. Frankly speaking, the reason why it's true is because pretty much any tool these days does it. So it's really not going to make one tool better than the other. Just because it can or cannot support Kanban workflow management. Every tool that wants to be in business of we're agile tooling company, they will offer it to us. So now it now becomes a question of organizational support for adaptiveness, agility. And with senior executives, I would probably not focus so much on whether it's Scrum or Kanban. I would focus on organizational design, impediments, and organizational implications of adaptiveness. What does it mean to be able to turn on a dime for a dime and be more responsive to changes coming from customers and users? I see David shared a good comment. Use causal loop diagrams with leadership, with managers, executives, so that they can themselves get to the root cause of what's bugging them, what's problematic. So, and again, if you want to have these conversations, whether it's from a Kanban, it would be expected that they go through appropriate learning curve, training, self-study, which is what are the odds of them doing that? So that's just my take on this. I mean, otherwise we're going to have to deal with uneducated consumers.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Anyone else, folks? We have a few minutes after the hour, so feel free to question, comment.
Hello, Gene. Tomáš Maleček here. I wanted to know your opinion on how could Scrum and Kanban be combined together, because in our environment we work as Scrum teams, several Scrum teams in SAFe at the bottommost level. But we have to cooperate with other teams that take care mostly of the infrastructure, of the 24/7 support and such things. We on the development team don't have such capabilities. We could not hold SLAs that support 24/7 applications. And I think sometimes we would benefit from transition to Kanban from Scrum, because frankly, part of the teams are really component teams. We're far away from the business.
So Thomas, thank you for asking. So you kind of setting me up for this, and I'll try very hard to avoid using the same reference you made at the beginning to what you use as the out-of-the-box commercial solution. Now, truth be told, so the problem is actually what you just described, and of course not against you, that's not your fault. You said we use Scrum at the bottom level. That right then and there, kills my, breaks my heart. That means the organization as the whole has trivialized and misunderstood the essence and purpose of Scrum. And of course, for large, complex organizational settings, it would be a large-scale Scrum because it has more teams and wider defined products. You have described some of the typical organizational weaknesses that we will oftentimes see being hidden or justified with Kanban. Like, we only have component teams, and therefore we're going to use Scrum. We're going to use Kanban. But at the same time, if we struggle, if we try a little harder, we can actually define a real product. And then if so, why not build cross-functional feature teams? Well, that means we challenge organizational design. And the way we do this today, we don't have to. So it's a matter of how how far we're willing to go improving things. With Kanban, we'll probably at the rudimentary ground level, as you say, although this should be that way. At least not in my view, you shouldn't be trivializing Scrum and Kanban to the bottom. You can visualize problems with your workflow, but are you going to do anything about fixing it? Are you going to go to above levels and layer and say, no, it shouldn't be sitting above Scrum or Kanban. It should be a part of our daily work. We should empower teams to do coordination. We have to empower teams to do architecture and integration. If we make these statements, these are powerful statements, right? So we may challenge organizational dynamics, and sounds like today in your whereabouts, this isn't a very customary thing. So
yeah, we're not customer centric. We work in safe, and the layers above us don't allow us to change things, to challenge the status quo, to go towards our end users and toward our customers, and to be more business oriented. So we are not completely component teams, but some of the teams are mostly component teams, and some of them just deliver some business assignments that are pre-analyzed, and it's decided it's part of this team's work.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. And I know it's painful, and I know when you're not, being allowed to do things and you are trivialized at the bottom layer. And we can say so much about adaptiveness and agility, but most likely it's very limited. And I'm showing this, graphic illustration of the problem you're most likely facing, because every time you have this multi-layered structure, whether it's the framework or tooling structure or the traditional org structure that you're not willing to challenge, you are stuck in the legacy, and your ability to be more adaptive with this approach, of course, is going to be very hindered. That's the answer.
This image speaks to me.
Yeah, feel free to download. I see there's, okay, so I see David answering to Andre's, yes, upstream skill or task is something that you essentially, if I'm here, this is my station and we're flowing this way, that something that has to be done on that side would be my upstream. Okay, I see we have lost quite a few folks. I'm happy to take another question, if you will, if anyone wants to ask, and if not, we will just gradually wrap this up. Okay, if there are no questions, well, thank you very much for joining. It was meant to be like less of a formal presentation, more of a discussion. We're gonna have a few very interesting speakers next time we meet as a meetup. All of the content that we shared today will be shared over here. Thank you, David, for periodically pinging this. So you can bookmark this page and also share it with others if they would like to replay. Taking a little bit of time to download the video and upload the materials. So hopefully today, tomorrow. Okay, well, thank you all for joining. Have a great the rest of the weekend, and have a productive week up ahead of you.
Thanks, Gene.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jane.
Sure.
Thank you.